Good to go. All right. All right. Thanks for joining us. Today is June 20th. We are joined together for a policy committee meeting. Have here with myself Dr. Temez, Superintendent Wimmer, myself, John Onson, and Chris Weiger should be on the way. We'll stand up now for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, I'll pass it off to Superintendent.
Thank you. So recall at our last meeting, we've been talking about the nepotism board and employee. Where we left off was to start looking at language in context with our former language. We had separated them out. There was pieces that we liked and wanted to hold to in our former language, but then questions for consideration. So we just wanted to go through that. To make it easy, I've got that, if you're following along at home, that is in board docs. That's in that portal. You can see kind of the evolution of our discussions, those pieces, but it's the very last one that says current language in context with new for discussion. So that's what I'm going to walk us through. And for us, I brought copies so I can highlight it. But again, we wanted to see it together to help us through. So what you see in front of you is exactly our current policy. I'm going to highlight the area in turquoise is new language. The rest is all of our policy. So in the first, we're talking about it as it relates to board. So if you look at the second page and kind of below those 1, 2, 3, those related to employees. But again, that's the current language. I'll do the same thing when we get to employees so you can see it in context. But let's go through the current language kind of point by point, right? So in the beginning, the first thing I've got highlighted is the statement, in addition, board members may not participate in any manner in any aspect of employment policies which affect a family member. In order to comply with these requirements, it's fully expected that any board member in such a situation recuse him or herself from the decision on such matters. So it's all the same language, but if we were to unpack what that says, let's go back and read that first sentence. In addition, board members may not participate in any manner in any aspect of employment policies which affect a family member. The preceding language is aligned to the state statute. This appears to be a local addition, which again, we can kind of make policy in those language. But if you read and interpret that, the employment policies is the 500 series. So in addition, a board member can't participate in employment policy. So that means when it comes to the 500 series of policies, that's what they shouldn't do. And then it goes further that compliance is noted as they recuse themselves from the decision. That means they don't participate in action. So if we unpack our current language, there could be, a disconnect between what that language says and perhaps that intent. So again, that whole first part aligned with the statute. The piece in yellow, thank you for joining us, Chris.
Sorry, my apologies.
That's okay. We knew you'd be en route. So when we look at that, it just means that someone with that relationship that we define a little bit further down wouldn't take action on policies in the 500 series. That's what those two lines mean.
And this is language that currently exists.
This is
in the current
all,
nepotism
yep,
policy.
sorry.
Sorry.
So to that point, Chris, we wanted to see it in context of all, this entire document is current language.
Mhm.
So I've struck the latter half of this because that has to do with employees. We'll take that up separately. So again, I think the question around our current policy and language lies in kind of where that is. I think it is easy to know that you can't make decisions involving family members, employment status, hiring, retention, promotion, evaluation, compensation, or trying to influence. That's, again, aligned to policy in there. A local piece for us is is that sentence. And it just means that a board member could not participate in the action associated with a 500 series. So that is the interpretation of those two lines. Is that what the board wishes to continue to see? I think that's where it lies around what are some of the restrictions when we have familial relationships.
See, and I don't read it the same way you do, and I think you're kind of pushing a point a little bit hard to kind of, maybe the direction that you want it to go, because that's how I'm reading right now.
How
Because
do you read that?
employment policies that affect a family member, that could be anything. Fiscal policies, something that changes, anything with a budgetary thing that could potentially affect a family member, doesn't necessarily have to be a 500 series policy.
So you're thinking that the budget is an employment policy?
Well, I'm just saying, it could be, pieces of it could be, and it says affects a family member, that any of these policies can affect a family member, so just because it was written as employment policy, it wasn't specified as 500 series employment policies.
Mhm. Then we have a challenge, because it sounds like we have different definitions, because the word policy was in there originally for a reason. I'm not sure what it is. We have different thoughts as to what it is. We use the word policy because it's within a policy. I tend to read it as, our policies, we have a chapter called employment.
Yeah, it's the
500
500
series.
series related to that, and they're on the website. If you would like to more broadly define it as policies, then I would suggest you remove the word employment. Because 500 is, the technical term is personnel, and those are the ones that deal with all the employment pieces. So I highlighted that in yellow because I think that's the discussion point that the committee and the board needs to have. So to your point, this is that interpretation, and I think that's where, as John, you were saying, you're reading it with a different interpretation. Let's make sure we expand on that, clarify the language, and build a shared understanding.
How would you propose, if you were to clarify it? Walk us through your thought process.
I just think it's been working the way it has, and like I stated before, I don't have any problem keeping it as is. So we keep talking about this thing over and over and bringing it back, and I think we're, wasting a lot of time doing that when we can move on to something else. We've already had a vote, it already came back and didn't pass. So, I'm still in favor of just leaving it as is.
And you can keep that language, but then it's the interpretation and how we exercise that. So that just means that, and even if again, we have a different interpretation to comply, compliance looks like they recuse him or herself from the action or the decision on policies that could be interpreted as related. And the language would stand. That, again, I'm just highlighting, this is exactly our current language, but highlighting, I think, where that interpretation needs to be clarified.
I think we run into the challenge of if we keep it the same, we're going to run into a dispute. If we clarify it, then we handle the dispute now. I'm going to suggest that we bring options to the board, and one option is to leave the language exactly as it is. The other is to define employment policies as policies in the 500 series. And so we bring options, and so we'll discuss them.
Can I just ask you, what specific concerns are you having, John? Like, what do you want to make sure doesn't happen? What do you want the goal of the policy to be?
The policy has been in place for however many years and hasn't had any issues. Changing anything would further open a new avenue of issues that can potentially take place. Right now, we've never had any pushback on this policy as it's written. It went through legal at the time, everything else, and it's a tried and tested policy.
Well, I think it did go through legal, but correct me if I'm wrong, but they expressed some opportunities for
clarification.
Yes.
Maybe there's a
and-
different way to phrase that, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think that when we had that, the legal at the time, as well as the most recent legal advice was consideration. And again, that's why we put together the language from legal prior to look at. Again, we can leave this, so what that means is, even if we took away any confusion around policies in general, right? That just means someone who's in that place where they are related as further defined, and we'll get to that piece. It just means that every time we take action, we would just have to consider that intersection and make sure that there was no confusion about that action. So it would come on the third reading or a second if you're going for full on policies that would be considered related to
So,
that.
in my understanding, nepotism was traditionally in place to prevent unfair advancement or special treatment regarding employment issues, whether that's hiring, supervising, raises, things that directly affect the spouse, partner, family member, whoever it is. The other policy that's on our docket, this one, 165, there's a conflict of interest one, which I think applies more specifically to the board member themselves to make sure we're not approving raises for ourselves or, selecting one, if I have a medical clinic, if I want my medical clinic selected as the one we use for the district, well, then that would be a conflict of interest, and that, of course, would be something I would recuse myself from completely. So I think we can look at it as, when I look at nepotism,
I'm gonna have to call point of order. If we're reading this as a employment policies, and you're saying 500, right now this isn't 500. We haven't made any changes to it. Technically, we are in violation right now
In what way?
with allowing a influence by Dr. Temez.
It says recuse himself from the decision. We have not reached decision point.
But
Discussion is valid.
But he's also influencing the decision-making on the policy that we're looking at right now.
Where is that
Which,
prohibited?
the nepotism, anything, this could potentially affect him and his spouse that work at the district.
But it says all he has to do is recuse himself from the decision. We've not reached a decision point. I understand your point of order, but I don't find it to be valid.
All right.
But I think to John, your point, if you're looking at that and we want to look at language that gets at, John, what you're trying to say is are you expressing that you would wish the language was written so that the discussion couldn't even, do we need to expand that, so discussion and decision-making around that piece? I think that might be the point that you're trying to make, that that there was a piece of discussion as well as decision that we should look at?
I might have to relook at this policy because
That's okay.
if I interpreted it wrong, then that's on me, but.
No, that's fine. There's a lot
The
of.
way I swear there's a part in here talking about influencing the decision, and this is influencing the decision.
The lines right above it that are highlighted, trying to influence others to extend special preferences, that's where the word influence is used.
I guess, is there something that has happened to this point so far, John, that you have concerns about, that I've somehow utilized nepotism to provide special treatment for a family member?
No, just the sheer, I guess, coincidence of the discussion around this after, as we sit in the board right now. We haven't had an issue with it yet, and currently we have 2 board members that have family members in the district, and now we're bringing this up. It's suspicious to me.
It predates me being on the board, this discussion.
Okay.
It does. The
But
third reading of this policy occurred before I was even on the board.
I think our board is really committed to trying to be transparent, trying to, making sure we've got kind of that moral high ground. And to that point, what we could easily do is use the existing language, you know, to John's point, you know, if that appears suspect or whatever, I think the only thing we would have to do, the language as written, is that monitor that every time we come to take action on a policy, that we do a supplementary review, because John, you were saying some of your interpretation, it might lie outside the 500 series, that we're just looking at that with scrutiny to see if there's any implication, so that people know and understand the potential for recusal in that. And I think we could do that. I think we could do a little bit of that as front work too. I can go through the policy series and see where I may find that, but we can also do that each time we bring, policies are read multiple times before the actual action. The language could completely stand. And again, if there's difference in interpretation around what's an employment policy versus that, we could easily kind of put that to the test each time there's a batch of policies. We do that work in chunks. We're relatively up to date. You know, we certainly have that lens to look through and that kind of piece as we sit at this table in committee to make sure we're in attention to it. So I think we could do that and leave that. Would that get around some of that interpretation or feeling like it's too narrow? John, specifically to your point prior, where you're saying some other policies outside of 500 might be, maybe that's the manner where we kind of do that test all along the way in committee, and that we're advising those with that connection around pieces that we would recommend recusal for. When it comes to policy action, we could do that.
Yeah, I guess you just have no idea what decisions touch what pieces of the school district, so.
Yeah, I
You
don't
know, I
disagree.
just feel like changing this and opening it up and being able to just, you know, kind of move about however could open us up to further influences, further, you know, issues that we might have down the road, and it's just,
Yeah,
like I said.
and
it's
I
been
think there's
working.
a shared understanding of what you're trying to protect, and make sure that we're above. We could certainly, as Chris said, bring the language forward, talk about the conversation and say, these are the checks and balances we're gonna put in place at committee, and kind of think about that piece before it comes to the recusal point of action, and make sure that we're doing that kind of test along the way.
And that's what I appreciate about this exercise, taking the existing language, and it sounds like there's a lot of language here that we think is fine.
Yes,
Really,
very.
we're kind of distilling it down to the word employment policies. I mean, other than that, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but the remainder of the paragraph, I think we said is okay. We don't have any issues or challenges, but there's a bit of difference of interpretation around employment policies. I think that's good to work out in advance, because if there's doubt as to what that means, we should make that crisp.
Yeah, I think it's the broad nature of it that raises the issues, because board members may not participate in any manner of any aspect of employment policy which affects a family member. And if John's saying policies can fall outside of that, like financial or budgetary policies, well, then I would argue that as a taxpayer, you're making decisions that influence your family member.
Yeah, and clearly
It
it's
doesn't say your family member has to be employed. It says policies which affect a family member. So when you make a decision about a tax levy or budgetary approval, you are affecting your family member. We all are. That's why it needs to be defined. That's why the statute language on the bottom has a qualifier that eliminates the scenario that I just mentioned.
Well, it says employment policy again, like superintendent said. So, you know, it doesn't say, obviously you can't, no one's gonna make a decision in here if they live in the district. You have to get an outside agency to make a decision on every single piece of tax that.
true.
Right.
And that's right, and I agree. I think that's why these definitions are important, because clearly there's a continuum here, right? You know, if my parents live in the district and I think about, oh, tax levy, I want to try to, you know, influence it one way or the other, you would think, well, that's a challenge. Yet at the same time, we are charged with having to levy taxes. And John, as you said, it's not like we can totally recuse ourselves, because otherwise we'd have to turn it over to I don't know who. So it's a continuum, and that's why, you know, these words are important.
And that's why I think the statute language in blue becomes important to help define who it is that is potentially receiving of the influence or of the benefit.
So I'm gonna, I think we've got the language to keep it as stands, talk about where the interpretation or that might be, but our work going forward, what I'm gonna do is, I'm gonna revisit the AR around creating policy. Because it might be in there, because what happens is, I need to make sure we're writing policy, that lasts beyond us, right? It's not about who's at the table, it's not about that, but anyone can come in and pick it up and execute and do due diligence. So I think the piece, because we're talking about, yep, we're very aware, and we're going to kind of watchdog that piece of this interpretation. I think maybe in the AR, we might have to put, and when you're looking at policy, you have, you know, some language around that. So I'm gonna revisit the AR and maybe put that on a future discussion around how we develop policy, and that kind of checks and balances might lie in there, so that that's a piece of it. And I think that could get at, you know, some of the concerns and confusion that's being raised around that. Does that seem like we could bring that forward to the board, keep that language, and that we're gonna revisit that to ensure that we're doing due diligence as we create or take action to help advise members who may be in that position?
So stated another way, when actions come before, we have clarification as to whether or not this is something we deem to be an employment policy.
Correct. Yeah, something that may
Something like that.
influence, yeah, something along those lines. I just am concerned because if we're kind of making that agreement that we as the team who do policy are going to do that, I need to have that written somewhere or something to be beyond us, right? What if I had a
It's part of the
different committee?
process.
What if I don't want to lose that piece of due diligence?
As part of the process.
Or- yeah.
Gotcha.
So, and that's something we could look at in the future as a committee. Is there any disagreement with bringing that forward as stated and leaving that? And just talking about the discussion we had?
So you're recommending bringing forward this
The
piece
yellow-
as written?
Yep, the yellow language, I think we just want to make sure that there's clarity when we do our work around policy, that we've done that test around, does it have implications for employment, and make a recommendation to any members who might have that familial tie to recuse themselves from the action portion of that.
From the action portion of things that have,
And, yeah, as written, it's the action portion against the, around the employment policy.
I think that's fine. I think we should have continued discussion on, we should be sure that we understand what an employment policy is, because otherwise administration's not gonna be able to enforce it, right? This is one of the challenges with statutes or with policies, where you can run into a circle, so to speak.
Yeah, so I think we could put that on the docket for our future work. But as John was said, you know, let's move this through and put this to bed in some way, but knowing that we don't want it to be, create a question of our board, nor do we want it to create conflict. The other piece that I had in the current language, right now in the language, if you, again, all current language, all fine. The next highlighted section, it says designated partner. Legally now that is called a domestic partner. And that's a legal relationship that people would enter into. So I do not know if that's what it was trying to get at in the past when this was done. Because we talk about cohabitation, sharing the same place of residence. So should we change that to the legal definition or leave that and then define what a designated partner is? I just feel like that was probably in the time before those agreements were in place, or it was to deal with cohabitation, which is further noted below.
Yeah, as we didn't exactly author this, we have to kind of divine intent a bit. And we've got spouse, former spouse, and the designated partner, which is, I looked it up, it's chapter 770, which is the individual who signed, files a declaration of domestic partnership. That's the legal construct that Wisconsin created for individuals who have some of the rights of marriage, but not all. And my point to there is, it's right next to the words spouse and spouse. So it would seem that would make sense, because if you're talking about, well, I'm just talking about the people who cohabitate. Sounds like that's dealt with later on. Financial dependent, codependent, sharing the same place of residence. So So I would think that that designated partner should be domestic partnership, domestic partner.
Any thoughts, John or Chad, on that?
No, I think the intent of that is clear as written. I mean, it says we can change it to domestic partner, but,
Either way.
I think designated partner is.
Could be interpreted
Yeah,
that way.
I would assume that's, but again, if we're cleaning things up, then that's an easy change to make.
John, thoughts?
I would agree. I mean, I think go either way. If it's,
Either way? Okay. Would you like me to kind of bring that forward to the full board for consideration and just say we're open to, because we can bring that for our first reading, ask them to give us their thoughts, change it based on that conversation, and still bring it forward for the second reading. Would that be okay?
As an option. Let's do that.
To do that? Okay. All right, then I will do that. And the only other piece is when it wasn't in the, or before the language in kind of the turquoise relates to elected officials, and it defines kind of what that relationship is in those pieces. So that is the statute language that kind of gives more kind of definition around things, so there's no question about what that means or doesn't mean. So I put that there for your consideration to add that language in some way so that the what that means is really clear. Because again, imagine someone, a board member, et cetera, that, they may not pick up the supplementary pieces, go to the statute, what exactly does this mean and how should it be interpreted? We should perhaps add that qualifying language into the policy itself. So I bring that forward for consideration for the team.
So really what that language does is that aids in the definition of what a financial dependent is, assuming correct?
Correct.
That's really what we're getting at?
Yeah, so some of the references in this policy, and you'll see that a little bit more in the other part, it says that we defined what a financial dependent was, and we really didn't. So I'm bringing forward the definition of financial dependent to add as consideration. It had previously referenced that we had it in, and it was not present, so I brought that forward.
Well, I like the language that helps define what it is when you have more than half, that makes it more objective, as opposed to, the $10 gift I give my nephew once a year kind of
Yeah,
thing. So,
well, and just for, any of the statute would take precedence over this, so certainly we have to comply with that, whether this language is here or not.
that's a good point.
So that is there, it's just whether or not we want that to be physically present alongside, so it's easy for our public and our board to know and understand the limitations of their work.
If it matches the statutory requirement,
Correct. And again, we're still held to that statute regardless of
Yeah.
it being present here or not, so it's really the group's consideration of what they would like in that policy.
well, if it's language you need to comply with, it would make sense to have it here so that someone doesn't need to chase down 2 locations. So it would make it more readable, usable.
Any thoughts from the others?
The second part of that clause that begins lineal descendants, likely was in the statute. Is that something we would need? I'm trying to think if there's a spot above that talks about lineal descendants.
Well, we're talking about family members and we fully define those. We include both the lineal descendants as well as some of those supplementary pieces.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's language that really guides those pieces around the who behind that. So again, you can strike all that, I just bring it forward for consideration.
Well, and that is language that's in the statute, you were saying.
Correct.
So we have to comply with it anyway.
Correct, that's what I'm saying. Whether or not it's present in policy, I just think it lends clarity for our public and for our board members. When I think of onboarding board members or holding people, it's fine, we go through those things, but
Yeah.
really for the team to consider.
Sure. compared to the current language, that lineal descendant actually adds more family members who would be covered by this.
Correct.
Arguably. So I don't know if there's a harm, especially because it's what the statute would require anyway.
Correct, or you could strike that one sentence, or you can keep it out entirely.
If anyone has a preference on that?
The statute technically law.
Correct.
Right.
So we can't, our board policies or school laws can't supersede or go
Correct.
at a less restrictive than the board. We
Correct.
can go more, but we can't go less. So I would say we have to leave that in if Chris is thinking that that's gonna extend the boundaries of descendants.
Mhm.
You raise an interesting point, John, too, because actually, where did I read this? Oh, it's in the middle paragraph. So that paragraph that begins in order to help ensure. It's actually the last sentence. This policy shall be subject to and superseded by any and all applicable federal and state laws and regulations.
Right.
And normally, when you see a policy being superseded by state laws, it would mean that the state law is actually superior and governs. And
Correct.
you can't bind it more than that, because hence supersede.
Correct, but this is in alignment with that, it doesn't take us out of alignment. But again, the prior language said that we had defined it, but when you look through, this is all our current language, it was not defined around, it said we defined it codependent and financial dependent, but we hadn't.
I think it makes sense to include it. It's state law, we need to comply with it. I may suggest relocating it up to where there's the definition, family member shall be defined as. We want to stitch lineal dependent in there somewhere.
So,
Or lineal
so
descendants,
right
sorry.
after, yep, so right after, so I would strike that sentence on there. We can talk about those things, but I would leave where we're defining, the financial dependent or codependent, and I would just say as defined, and follow that up with that financial
Mhm.
codependent. So I'd leave that piece there. And again, we can bring that forward to the board and talk about the same discussion you've had here, whether we want, and see what their thoughts are.
Sure.
And come away with that change without having to bring it back and hash it through committee.
Mhm.
We can respect that, bring that back for that second reading. So if the team's fine with that, I'll just bring that up, highlight it, we'll have that same conversation, and we can move from the first to the second to be efficient on that.
Okay.
That first, again, the strike-through language is for things that deal with employees. I felt that parts of number 2 could be also considered because of that relationship, but I've also struck through immediate family members. We defined it in policy as family member. We didn't say the word immediate, so I'm just trying to make that definition be consistent throughout the policy language. So I struck the word immediate there, but we want the most qualified applicants, so I think that sentence still stands, but I'd ask for your interpretation.
So just to clarify that, so the original policy,
This is the original.
yep, this says the word family member shall be defined as spouse, former spouse.
Correct.
It doesn't say immediate family member.
Correct,
So
it
your
does
point
not.
is the use of immediate family member would be
Conflates,
confusing.
yeah, conflates the definition.
If we define it as family member, we should stick to family member.
Yes,
That would seem to make sense.
And just to be clear, are we looking at this policy, this then would be the policy that would stay rather than the 165.2?
you would relabel it to 165, I think it would be 2. We would relabel it. So it would come out of the 500 series, we're saying split them, so it would become in the 165.
So what are we
series of
doing
it.
with the 165.2 that's written?
So you would have, we just talked about, that was the evolution of our discussion in language. So when you're looking at what is there in, if you're following along in board docs, so you had a couple things. One was us pulling out the language and looking at it separately. One was the current policy as it states. One was what we had worked on with legal to update that definition. And we wanted to see all those concepts married together and in print. So that is what I had done in that very last one.
The
So the
165.2.
one that we're looking at now, I would clean that up, I'd bring that forward, it would be relabeled, the 165.2. I've got it as one on top of
So
it.
but there's currently 165.2 written.
There, it is not, it is nested in the 511.1. I'm saying this portion of it should come out and be labeled 165.2.
Right, because
What am I
the
looking at?
original, correct me if I'm wrong, the original nepotism policy is in the 500 series.
So imagine,
Yep, no, I'm with you, I'm just wondering, what
this
am I
is the
reading
whole
exactly?
current, this is the whole current policy.
What is this?
That was an updated 165 that we worked with legal on, and we were saying we would rather use the foundation of our current language and be in attention to what their advice was, and that's what I'm bringing forward to you right now.
Okay.
Yep, good
So
question.
165.2,
Yep,
as I'm
so
reading it
this
here,
would become,
is not, this
Nope.
is not a separate document.
nope, the
This is
concepts,
legal.
yep, those concepts are not in conflict with what I'm bringing you forward to look at today. So the task at hand was to bring forward all those ideas, put it in the context of our current language, and stay true to that current language.
Because I just want to, because I just want to also get to the intent of the policy here. And so, John, do you have this 165.2 document? It's got some blue in the middle of it here. It was one of the, maybe one of the last ones down there or something.
Yep, it's the third document, it's like a
Yeah,
standalone,
Yeah. I
and the
think
third
John's
attachment.
So if you read the last sentence, and this is maybe where you were getting influence from, John, but if you're reading the last sentence, board members may not make any decision directly impacting an immediate family member's employment status, including hiring, retention, et cetera, to the family member. So I feel like, is that the, so you're trying to safeguard the integrity of the process, which I appreciate, and I'm asking then, is this something that you are looking for then? Does this cover what you're looking for, where we're saying, you know, like, because I have a spouse in the district, I should not be involved in deciding her pay raise, which I agree with. I should not be involved in a decision that allows her to get benefits suddenly, which if she doesn't have them, which I agree with. So to me, I feel like those are decisions that would just involve someone's, you know, someone having integrity around not involving themselves in those decisions, versus making a decision about changing a gym schedule, which is an employment policy potentially, but doesn't affect, you know, I mean, it doesn't, you know what I mean? There's nothing disingenuous about saying, yes, we're gonna have, so my wife works at Fair Park, there's nothing disingenuous about saying, we're gonna have Fair Park switch from, you know, 8:30 in the morning to 8:50 in the morning or something, like, that doesn't really, I'm just saying like that, I don't think that there's any malintent around being involved in anything regarding that kind of decision, versus what I think the policy is here to protect is somehow my wife getting promoted based on the decision I made. I'm just trying to get to the heart of that. Is that what you're trying to protect, John?
That's what I think the district needs to protect, is the illusion of anything like that happening.
Right.
And any question that, nope, we have actually things in place that say this couldn't have happened in our current policy and the way we're supposed to run things. So there's not gonna be an argument to it. If somebody wants to say, I think he had influence in this being, you know, this person being promoted over me because of their family or friends or good or relatives somewhere, whatever it is. But I don't think 165.2 we're even looking at using. I think that was,
We have that
No,
same
I'm just-
line in there.
Yep, and really what I'm just trying to get at is, does that last sentence include the things you're trying to safeguard? Because I agree with that, I agree with you. I do not think that any of our positions on the board should directly influence a favorable decision to our family members. I agree with that. That, you know, if there's a decision around compensation and it involves the pool of employees that involve my spouse, I would recuse myself from that decision. I mean, that, whether the policy existed or not, I would do that because it's the right thing to do. So I'm saying like things that directly affect your family member is, I think, what the heart of the policy is here to protect. So, I know we're splitting hairs on a few things, and it's good to clarify language, but I think that's the heart of what we're trying to protect.
Yeah, and I think the full board needs to identify what employment policies are the none of this. I'm not gonna say one way or the other, this is what it should be, but yes, I don't think a rounded general fund vote has anything to be concerned about, but I'm not gonna define those here. I'm just not. I think that's up for the whole board to discuss and define what employment policies should we make sure we're actively engaging and looking at when we're coming in contact with them, if we have a board member that has a family member in the district, or, whatever. So that's, I think, something that the board has to decide and,
So I've got
define.
that circled, yep, I've got that circled, that, we'll bring forward and really detail that in our discussion with the board around the concept of employment policies, and also that designated versus domestic, partner, to bring that forward, as you said, for the full board, to provide a little bit of clarity, direction, and we can easily do that between the first and second readings, to do that without us having to come back to committee on those pieces. And that statement has persisted in every iteration of this policy, to that point, to protect that and keep that in, even though you're looking at that there, it's actually the third sentence in, on what we're looking at right now. So I think, if that's okay, I think then we have this to a point to bring that forward for consideration, tweak those two things, and then to John's point, do a little bit deeper dive in the policy and maybe review and look at which policies that may lend itself to on that.
Yeah, I appreciate the exercise because there's a lot that I think nobody had an issue with, and this allowed us to kind of narrow down the nub of some of the difference in interpretation. So we advance those and proceed.
Yeah, so is the group okay with that? Bringing that forward for the board then to discuss as a potential first reading on this, to keep that language intact, but talk about those two pieces that we wanted them to weigh in on to further define?
And where will they be defined? On the policy
Yep.
itself?
Yep.
And then just a clarification, the bullet point 1, no administration, that's being moved to the employment.
That's
portion.
employee, yep, I've got a separate one for employee.
I saw that one.
Okay, great, I've got a path forward on that. So the next one then is employee, okay? So it's gonna look exactly the same. I brought you exactly the language that we've got so that we could see it in context, if you wanna pass that down. So now what I did was the exact inverse, right? I struck out the pieces that had to do with the board. This would stay in the 500 series, but I struck out the pieces of board, but I left everything the same. Recall, I struck the words an immediate family member, because we keep saying family member, but then we're introducing a new term of immediate family that could have different meanings. So I'm just keeping us centered around the term family member. I've got the exact same definition of family member, so we're always consistent in policy. Same discussion whether we're using designated partner or domestic partner. The blue language would be struck. That only had to do with elected officials, so I don't need that or to entertain that. And then all those points below stay, so 1 and 2. But if you look at number 1, again, I'm striking immediate family member because I'm introducing a new term and I want to hold with family member. And then I'm striking where it's preceded. It's already stated in policy, so I don't need to have those pieces.
Let me make sure I understand that. So who is a family member, and then it goes on to say, or financial dependent or codependent, and you're striking it because if you look up to the family member shall be defined as, it already includes financial dependent or codependent. So,
Correct.
So there's no need to repeat that. It's already nested in the definition of family member, so it's just redundant.
Correct. It
Okay.
was part of the original definition.
Okay. So I didn't want anyone to believe that, oh, we're getting rid of it. It's like, nope, it's
Nope,
already in
it's
there.
right there.
All
Yep, that's how I'm defining family member
Mhm.
in policy. So same thing, I don't need the word immediate family member, I've defined family member. I don't need financial dependent or codependent, because that's how I defined the word family member. And then I kept using, if you look at the next page, A and B, we kept using different terms. person similarly related, person related, someone related. I just kept us going back to the same word, a family member, because it's very clear in policy who that is, because I've defined it. So those were fine. And then the third point, this was time of adoption of the policy. So the adoption of this policy was way back when, but if we amend this, it should be at the time of amendment as well. Around.
Yeah, because we're
So,
changing.
yeah,
it,
when
we're
you
changing
touch
it
it,
midstream.
yeah, correct. So I offer those for consideration for the team. I think it, one, provides a consistent definition. John, that was your point before, where it felt like the two had differing definitions. So I made sure that we've aligned exactly, and then I kept driving us towards that one family.
And so a lot of the changes are simply just relabeling it as family member to make it consistent. We talked about the amendment piece.
Correct.
Do we even need to have it at time of adoption, or can we just strike that out since it's already adopted? If we're cleaning it.
Good question.
Point.
We
Going
don't, I
forward,
mean,
you guys
because
have
this was
amendment.
already in place, I do not believe I have anyone in conflict
Yeah.
at
Sure.
all. I will double check because this was previously adopted. So no one should be in conflict, to John's point of that. Those contracts should have expired, et cetera. I'll do a final double check of that. And if it's okay and I've cleared that hurdle, I will bring it forward without that number 3 bullet, to
Makes
John's
sense.
point, and then I would just renumber 4.
Well, this basically remains the same as what we currently have.
Correct.
Just to clarify this, just, for those listening, when we talk about nepotism, this is not necessarily that, if you have siblings, one works at one school in the facilities area and one works in the other as a teacher, that's immediately prohibited. This is about the supervision.
Correct.
And,
The direct hiring, supervision, and evaluation of that person. We're a small and generational community. We certainly have staff who are related. We want the highest quality candidate. We don't want that to be, to that point, some kind of special privilege that you get that makes me look away from a lesser candidate, nor do I want it, a circumstance in that. But again, it precludes you from hiring, supervising, or evaluating your own family.
Any objections to moving that forward? Okay.
Great.
Yeah, go ahead.
I have one more thing. I think we've discussed it before, but a update to the employee handbook
Correct. This
should
would,
be done with any amendments on these.
yes,
So
this
they're
would
adding
go
them, they
in
should
there. Yep.
align.
Yep.
But, I mean, do we need to have it in here, or is that not?
Oh, do you want it to say that it would be part
Just
of
to
the
make sure that
employee
we're
handbook?
keeping things,
Yep.
in alignment with employee handbook or whatever.
Mhm.
Because I know there was
Mhm.
one concern about if it's in the employee handbook, it can be changed.
Sure.
So how do we make sure that they're aligned and that the board has visibility into what's being changed on the employee handbook side?
To your, and to your point too, so we'll add a statement around that this would be included in that it's our obligation to include this in the employee handbook, and any changes should also be changed in that. Again, then that makes sure that institutional knowledge lives well beyond our tenure, that it's always duly stated. Employee handbooks, we said, were the checks and balances, so this would be so stated in there, and then our employees sign off on those annually. So we'll just put some language in there to John's point around this would be stated, signed off, and it would be mirrored, that there's, like you said, you can't change one without the other. So I'll put something, if you're okay with that, I'll just put that at the end around that obligation. Thank you.
All right, does that take us to,
Next is the Fantastic 300
300s.
series.
All right.
We had a great curriculum meeting. So as you know, we've been talking at length with our community sharing concerns, our curriculum committee meeting. We had a really good meeting the other day where we dug into all the policies. Before I get into the policy part of it, I'm gonna go to the meat of kind of what we don't wanna see in some of our books and those pieces. So it unpacked, I think some of the language was up for interpretation. So that's what we did, you know, what's age appropriate, who gets to say, who gets, you know, what did we wanna see? So I'm gonna start this team with that, and then what the curriculum committee wants to see in language. So to get into the guts of it. And that, so this isn't a specific policy if you're following along. It's not connected to a specific policy. It is stated as an attachment, and it's supplementary language for review. It's the very last piece. And this pulls on the conversations that we've had at the board level with our public in curriculum committee. I've worked across districts. We've been talking to superintendents, and in the county, we talked about this last time. So our language, and I took every kind of nebulous word out of the policy, and we defined. So this is what the curriculum committee, we discussed and wanted to move forward to this team to help get it into the language. But primary instructional materials, we wanted to be really clear. Those are books that are used for instruction with all students in the classroom. They're considered primary resources. Selection of primary resources should consider the appropriateness of the material based on both the developmental and chronological age of the child. So what we've added is the definitions there of what those mean and how those are interpreted. So the developmental age represents intellectual, social, emotional, and physical functioning of a child. So for example, you could have a 12-year-old functioning at the level of a 5-year-old. So there's that developmental piece. And then chronological is simply from birth, looking at that lapse time. So it's your age upon your birthday. So that's how that piece is defined. Any questions about that?
So this would be attached to what policy?
So it goes into the resource selection one, but we have the statement in there around developmental and chronological age. So we're adding all the definitions and all the parameters, right, to that. So we didn't have much around adding these and what they mean. They're pretty well defined.
So I'll just add a little piece of, research that I came up with. So I did a little research on basically what makes a movie R-rated. An R-rated motion picture in the view of the board, so there is literally a board that reviews these things, contains some adult material. The film may include adult themes, adult activity, hard language, intense and persistent violence, sexual-oriented nudity, drug abuse, or other elements, so that parents are counseled to take the rating very seriously. Here's the definition of it, of what makes it. A single scene depicting violence or nudity will typically draw a PG-13 rating. If the violence is pervasive or nudity is sexual, an R-rated is more likely. Nuance matter in language to using sexual divide. So I looked up how many F words actually can be used until it's an R-rated movie. One. In a PG-13 movie, you get one F word before it's deemed an R-rated movie. So I would love to see. Obviously we can do a little bit more research and actually look up the definitions from the U.S. rating boards.
I think that's getting at the very next point.
Okay.
So let's go through that. So I don't think we have a confusion around how we come up with the age of a child. And that sometimes a child might be physically a certain age, but cognitively they could be functioning at a different age, and we wouldn't expose them to materials that they weren't cognitively or developmentally able to be exposed to. So it's just the two-pronged consideration. To John's point, appropriate materials, so we would be adding this in policy, appropriate materials should be free of excessive obscene language, sexual content, and graphic violence. And then we worked on the definitions for each and every one of those. So let's take those one at a time. So for us, it was excessive use of obscene language. That includes language that's deemed derogatory or obscene. So the racial or sexist slurs being offensive, profanity considered, part of obscenity. So let's talk about language. Is there any pieces that you want to expand on or look at?
What policy are we looking at here?
So.
Or are we just looking at this still?
Yep, first I'm trying to get us to some shared definitions. It would go into 361 around material selections, and I can walk us through when we get to that point. We use general language that says we're gonna do this, but we never defined it. So that's what we worked on, was creating those definitions and the scope so that they can be integrated into the policy. The language doesn't exist in this manner right now. So that's why I'm leading with the shared definition, and then I'll walk us through where we would insert that.
So these would be stitched into 361-1, selection of resources.
Correct. So we use terms like instruction material, what does that mean exactly? So that's what we were doing, was we were unpacking every definition. So when you look at the language aspect, so we were talking about all the aspects that we wanted to kind of make sure we were having due diligence on in our resources. That is what we discussed for obscene language. Again, racial, sexual, profanity. Is there anything that this team is seeing that's missing or should be added in some way?
I mean, we're gonna have the same issue. Who's gonna say it's excessive? What's excessive to somebody might not be. I mean, I think we need a number to this thing. And if we follow the whatever this board is called, the U.S. ratings board, one F word, is excessive for a PG-13 book, and that's just PG-13.
Mm-hmm.
That's not even saying it's appropriate for anybody under the middle school grades.
Mm-hmm. So we had the same conversation around excessive and where that is, and we were actually going to take excerpts from specific pieces and have that same thing. There is no one magical rating system. We were going to be looking at the intersection of a few of them, and then come back and kind of set that bar that we could follow up with some supplementary definitions so that we were meeting that. We were going to do some work together as a committee around that.
But there is a magic rating system. I mean, like I said, we rate movies every day.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the U.S. has a rating. And I know we all tried it as high school students, tried to get into a rated R movie when we weren't allowed to, and they won't let you in for a reason. And that's following the rating guidelines that we have in this country. I mean, like,
yeah, not a problem. Is it the recommendation of this committee for that committee to use that as its?
I would like to research this further, what their rating standards are, how they're defined. I don't think, a quick Google search is gonna be enough information to add to a policy right now.
Yep, we don't
But I just wanted it as a idea, something to put out there. We do have, they define it as one F word, makes it a rated R movie.
Yep.
Or more than one.
More than
One F word is allowed in a PG-13, and anything more than that is R.
So that was the same conclusion that the committee came to, and they're gonna take on that leg of the work to do that. We started pursuing different rating sources in those pieces so that we could do that and then look at samples and kind of draw that line and bring it forward. So you're drawing kind of the same conclusion that we did at committee.
Actually, there's two ratings to that, Jen, so just so you know this, so there's R and then there's NC-17. So rated R movies are suggested for 17 and older, but they're still allowed in to see that movie with parental approval.
Sure.
NC-17 is actually no child under 17, regardless of parental permission. So, and then there are also unrated, which means that these are just movies not rated by that organization, and then that's anyone could, it's a wild card. So again, the PG, the parental guidance suggested is, again, someone looking at age-appropriate material based on the parental choice. So I agree with you. I'm not completely opposed to that definition, actually. I'm just clarifying that even rated R, the parents still have a decision to let their kids go see rated R movies.
Yep.
So same thing, that committee came up with the same thing, that we needed to further define exactly what those levels were. We were gonna pull and look at some books and look at multiple sources that kind of hit that, so that we would be more restrictive than that.
But I would say, so the parents have the option to let their kids see that, but as a school, we shouldn't give those students an option, you know, in our facilities. I mean, you know, that's not on us to go out of the way and offer up a rated R book to a student in our school. So I don't even think those should be an option in the school, honestly. And I would be, you know, the definition of excessive MC, I don't know how you would do that without the rating system in place. Or
How do you restrict 17 and 18-year-olds though?
17 and 18-year-olds, that's not the majority of the school.
It's all juniors and seniors.
Yeah, it's mostly seniors. I mean, and yes, I mean, do they need to be, is that really something that's still appropriate for a school? There's gotta be other, more appropriate options for a school setting.
Well, John, what I hear you saying is you're interested in the consideration of, or investigation of standards, right? Maybe it's the movie one, maybe it's a different one. Sounds like the committee's already,
Correct, the
Interested in the
committee's
same
got that
thing.
for their next piece.
yeah, but I think there's some interest in, if there's some sort of scoring mechanism or something that helps make this easier so we don't have to get, and I appreciate this. This is what I was talking about some weeks ago when I say, we've got to develop a yardstick here, because if we don't have a yardstick and we're not using the same yardstick, we're going to be around this forever. And this is an important discussion. So I agree. But I take it as, maybe it's that system, maybe it's a different system, but you're interested in learning more about evaluating a rating system.
So that, again, that was the same conclusion that the committee came to. We're actually gonna pull pieces and look at multiple systems and how they could be applied to resources outside of, like you said, the video pieces for that. So that was the next step. We don't want to, what we didn't want to do, because we talked about the timeline that we have with summer, right? We get to be in this pause for summer to do and take some steps forward on this work. So we wanted to continue moving forward and then put together a timeline for that work so that we were ensuring when we open our doors in fall that the things that were going in front of kids for instruction were meeting kind of this newer test. So not perfect, but we wanted to keep the work moving forward so that we had that readiness. So that was that next piece, was bringing that forward with the timeline with the committee too. The next bullet was around sexual content, explicit detailed description of any sex act. Any questions around that? Okay. Then we talked about graphic violence, the depiction of representation of vivid, brutal, realistic acts of violence. For example, decapitation, dismemberment, mutilation, maiming, or disfiguration. We have a lot of discussion around this because I taught 6th grade history, medieval times, and you know what? Hey, people were drawn and quartered. People were decapitated in the French Revolution. Where's the intersection of what that means historically? And we really centered on, it was the piece around vivid, descriptions of those pieces. So that it wouldn't box out some of those instructional pieces, some historical things that happened, all of that, but it got into that kind of, graphic depiction of violence.
Yes, let me see if I understand that. So when you talk about depiction or representation, so if you're in the French history class and say it was common for them to
Behead.
to behead people.
Correct.
That's a fact. You're not depicting it, you're not representing it, as opposed to, let's do a reenactment, let's watch a video
Right,
on
I'm
it.
not watching a 5-page, his lips kept moving, with all this I'm not getting into a graphic depiction of it. We also talked about that, pulling some sources so that we could read as a team and look at and make sure we were centered. Because even though we kind of walked away with that shared understanding of where that would be, we wanted to have some samples that were kind of leading and going, and this is that point. So that we could have samples and we could even use some passages so that we were really clear with our public, our families, around where that discussion was. But we had a lot of discussion around what made that different.
And even in some of I know, even in some of our classes that do elaborate on some of those war scenes and stuff like that, the students do have to be a certain age and have to have parental consent to join that class.
Correct.
So even in some, age-appropriate school textbooks and information, we still are telling informing the parents and the families that, hey, this is gonna be graphic with, scenes of war and whatever else, and you guys have to sign up for your kids to be on this class. So, I mean,
The class, or even that piece or that lesson, right? So, to your point, we want to make sure, and we talked a lot about our website's being redone over the summer and the curriculum website, and we want to make sure that we're informing families so that they can make decisions in advance, and they can, or maybe they're participating in that, but they want to have that awareness so that they're following up with conversations at home, that they're using that. So to your point around leading with what's appropriate by level and then further defining that, then getting into what that means, and then where's the piece of consent for a family, for a parent, so that there's awareness in that piece. And it gets at course selection, but I'll grab that next. That books that depict the use of drugs or alcohol as admirable. So we had talked about kind of glorifying the use of drugs and alcohol. Certainly we've talked about pieces that are cautionary tales that don't glorify that. So not absent of, but things that we're not going to be like, hey, an 8th grader looking at a party scene in a book, and somehow, making that glorified or admirable, that there's drug use in any way in that piece, so. Any question or things that we need to look towards expansion? Again, our team in curriculum, I'll continue to work alongside them for kind of that excessive piece and those samples so that that's more clearly defined. But at least this is a really large step forward for us.
Yeah, I was going to say, I can't, it's like I think what John was saying before, I can't sit here and say these 4 bullet points represent the entire universe of issues, but they sure look like a good start.
Correct.
Like a solid frame.
Yep, and to that point around some of the things that we already started putting in play was, and they're on the backside, but I'll get to them now, was making sure that we were taking the burden of informing families onto ourselves, so that it wasn't just the title of a book, it was really the alert around what is the content, what's the overall story, but what's the content in that book for consideration, going through our book list to make sure that they weren't predominantly held with content of this nature. We talked about it in curriculum committee, there are thousands and thousands of titles out there. And what we choose as those primary text resources to put in front of kids, that's a choice we can make. Those things can be available, accessible in other avenues, libraries, etc. But for us instructionally, this is kind of what we're going to do. But we're going to take that burden of information so that people could see, and maybe it leads them a little bit more. We spoke a little bit about this. I know it's on the backside. We got to that. So we talked about multiple sources, so not just the movie rating system, but there's also other multiple sources around books and text selection, but they might be backed by different organizations and things like that. So we were going to create and design a webpage that would be readily accessible to our families, give them enough to look at that, and then lead them to other sources and say, here's 5 different pieces that might rate, explore them, here's how you access them, here's this. Find one that works for you, your family, or if you have any question, give us a call, and we would help them kind of find what works so that we were providing information, but also they had some access and some knowledge because they might not know about all those rating sources. So we would define that as, these aren't district selected or sanctioned, but we want you to be aware of these, and here's some common ones. So we thought that educational piece was really critical for our families. So jumping ahead a little bit on that, but to John's point before, there was a piece around course selection. Students are provided to select specific courses of study, which will include the overview of the content, as well as all the resources that would be used in that. So you've got that opportunity. Families can review, approve, or deny any of their child's course requests. So, if there is a specific course that's going to be centered around something, parents have that authority and can do that. So that would be so stated in advance, so that when they're making those selections, they're very aware, and to John's point, you may, choose a different course at that age. Maybe that is or isn't of interest, or that fits with what your family would like to see studied, but parents have that authority.
Just so I understand the words of that last sentence, families can review, approve, or deny any course requests. Now, that doesn't mean that you get out of math. You're talking about materials?
Correct,
Just
correct.
explain that to me a little
Yep,
bit.
and to your point, we'll make sure that we've got that nested in there the right way. Correct, they have to take your basics of math and those pieces, but there may be, to the point, mythology, and there's a mythology book, there's concepts in mythology. Sometimes mythology can be brutal, right? The things that were going on mythology-wise, there was a lot of racy things going on in addition to the violence. So, that's a course that they may look at the content, look at the resource, and make a decision on that piece. And that is not required for a student. They have multiple courses that they could select.
So just explore that, so if.
Make
so-
sure that's clear.
No, that's, thank you. If a parent takes a look at the mythology text and says, I just don't think that's appropriate for my child.
Yeah.
The remedy is not, well, you get a second mythology book. It's like, no, that's the course. So your remedy, so to speak, is, well, there are many other English courses you can
There's
choose from.
multiple options. Our students, our size affords us a lot of options for our students. So there's a plethora of options they could take in person. There's also an additional slate of options that may be virtual. I don't think we're without options that meet the interests
Great.
of our students when you get into those levels. Then we got into the individual book selections for instruction. So students are sometimes provided with choice regarding book selection for the purpose of instruction. So often called book clubs, it's a time when students participate in shared reading, discussion regarding a selected title. The book choices will be shared with families prior to use, will include a general description of the book as well as required signature to authorize the student's selection. So again, that's taking that burden of making sure we're very clear what those are. We're gonna be going through and going back through those book lists to again, make sure they're not predominated by, books that are hitting these bullets of, graphic violence, et cetera, that there's a really large continuum of choice. But again, making sure all those lists have that we're informing, and that parents are consenting to that.
Can we add, if we come up with a rating system of sorts, can we add that to the individual book selection for instructions within that description portion?
Yes, I would
I mean-
foresee that would be there. And in addition, even if we didn't, we'd be sharing those additional rating sources so that they can go further beyond what we're providing. So absolutely. I will make sure, we talked about, and I put in there, I think it was Melanie and I were discussing kind of that, you need to review this carefully as a family, and, kind of, because you get a lot of pieces of paper as a parent, and making sure that they understand the implication of the trip. Please review carefully. Some of the content may not be aligned with that. Here's resources for you to do. Here's this. Here's a summary of these books. Call with any questions, kind of thing. So that we'd be reworking that sheet a little bit to show that.
So, the only thing I see as a problem is, individual book selection, and I'm all for, you want your kid to read that, you don't care, go for it. But there are gonna be parents and members of the district that don't want their students to read those. But if we have them available for a book club, that means they're probably in our libraries.
We're going through all the book club lists and looking at it in relation to these bullets to move back on those, so it's not part of those choice book clubs. So, like I said, there might be some titles available in libraries, and we'll look at kind of the developmental chronological age and that kind of where we land on when those things are appropriate. But we're re-looking, that's the timeline that we're setting as a curriculum committee, for us to have that re-look at those and make sure that those titles are sparse, if any, on those required lists.
Seeing a rating system would be so much easier. You can set a rating limit to each kid if you don't want your kid to read anything over there, they can't even check the book out.
It would be great, and publishers are actually, we said publishers are starting to think about and design that, but right now, people are trying to grasp at a rating system that doesn't exist for books. So you see them starting to look in the publication world about that, but it doesn't exist. So right now, it's up to us to be at the forefront of figuring out what that is for us. I think, John, to your point, I think that's where the market will go. And they'll start doing that and probably giving us access to materials that would support, things that are already in libraries, et cetera, to do that. But I think that absolutely will be, we should probably market, distribute, maybe we sell our work once we get it here and, as a model.
I was even gonna say, I don't know if there's, other districts looking at doing this that we can work with and.
Sure, I can speak to that. So we talked about that in curriculum committee. I've attended other board meetings, and I work with superintendents not only in our county, but just southeastern region in general. This is not unique to us. This is a conversation that's occurring everywhere. So I have actually shared all these materials. We've cross-shared across districts, kind of where they're at, struggling with the same pieces. We might be slightly a little bit more ahead on that, and then we're going to be convening this summer to go through those things. So we're kind of staying in touch. In fact, when we started talking about fleshing out so parents knew and understood, I'm like, hey, hang on, I started already. Let's divide out the libraries and get the work so we can accelerate it through. There's no reason for multiple districts to be doing the same work. So we've talked about kind of sharing that work. So to your point, yes, we are all working across systems. The next piece was classroom libraries. The other place that you would see books. Classroom libraries are small, cultivated collections of materials housed in a classroom environment that provide immediate access to materials for student reading at appropriate reading levels. So a third grade, you walk into a classroom and you see bookshelves, right? And they're just readily accessible for kids. So in those, they would be leveled. They're leveled for the kids' range of readers, so you wouldn't see, third grade classrooms not going to have those pieces. Now I could have a unique situation, but I'm really working hand in hand with the family. Let's say I have an accelerated reader. It's someone who's gifted in reading. They're an 8-year-old, but they're reading at a much higher level. That's where the developmental piece comes into play. It also works inversely, where that child, while an advanced reader, is not developmentally ready to take on the heavy weight of some of the subject materials, so you have to scout that a little bit differently. So in the case of classroom libraries, we have, again, putting family front and center, where contact your classroom teacher or teachers to ensure that the library book selection meets the expectations of your family. I prefer our child do X, Y, and Z. That is something very easily. So those do not have, I wouldn't say, graphic novels, things like that. Maybe if they're on a bookshelf in a high school or things of that nature. But in every classroom, from early learning on up, there's bookshelves and there's books in front of kids that they could get. They're not part of the instruction, but they're present. And how do we work, kind of hand in hand with our families? And we're saying this is the route, and just let us know and we will make sure. Because to do that work and go through each classroom library and all that, we are monitoring how donations are accepted, what titles get to come into schools, all of those pieces. But this really helps the family say, this is where this line is, please make sure. The same thing with a library media center. So a family can ask their child to log in. This will be part of that page so families can see and monitor this, some instructions. So a family can ask their child to log in, or they can use their child's login credentials to access the library's online resource database. It's called Destiny. And Tim and his team will put together like a little video of how to do that, to view any book in our collection, as well as all of their child's currently checked out books. Same thing with that, it's very easy. If a family would like to restrict access for their child, simply contact the Library Media Center staff, and they can flag some notes so that when they're doing checkout of materials. Again, I've worked with families before, not here, like I prefer my child not read superhero stories. Batman, Spider-Man, I don't know, elementary, not a problem, I can absolutely honor that. And you flag it, and you help work and do that.
Is that,
And then it's a way for families to also log in and monitor, so there's not any slips through that system.
the example that you just gave us, that's something that would apply, at the prior section, we talked about book selections from classroom libraries,
Same
right?
thing.
Third grade classroom.
Yep.
And,
I
you have
don't,
a parent who
Yep,
prefers not to,
I don't care for this book series, or I don't care for this author, or I don't care for this type of content. Please make sure, and it's easy.
and that's an example, sorry to interrupt, where staff administration has taken a look at it and said, that is what we would consider to be an age-appropriate piece of material to begin with. It's just that
Correct.
this is a family
But
preference.
this is honoring family preference, so like I said, I've had, I don't want superheroes. Okay, that's not a problem, here's how you do that. And then we talk through a curriculum committee, you know, you do that in a manner that's respectful to the child and the family. It's not like, oh, no, you're not allowed to have that. Little kids, when they're doing book selections or something like that, oh, I know you love such and such. Have you considered this? This is a new title and all that. You're working with that. And having those conversations, and you work that out, and then you might be doing a follow-up, you know, so-and-so really was, here's what if there's another title, let me know. Yeah, those are really close relationships with families, and it gives, again, that empowerment back to the family, and then the means in which how to monitor that as well.
And how often will communication go out if that library's changed in the classrooms? The classroom libraries, let's say they add books throughout the year.
Correct, they do. They do all the
So
time.
how do we keep track of that if there is a kid, you know, that the parent doesn't want a certain book and all of a sudden that certain book ends up, but they only saw the list of books at the beginning of the year?
Oh, they're more, like you said, they're not gonna go through classroom library, there's no comprehensive list or things like that. That is more, here are the concepts, the authors, et cetera. And then that teacher in that room is looking at and knows those titles so that they're complying with that. So it isn't just about that singular title, to your point. It's a little bit more broad than
But
that piece.
that's solely on that teacher's ability to, you know, take your values and say, this applies to this book or doesn't. I mean, that's all up for interpretation, that could be anything. I mean, how do you standardize that? Because we have a whole group of people that pick the curriculum for the school,
Mhm.
and that's not part of it. Not saying I'm against the books
Yeah.
in this, because I understand,
Yeah.
they have all those little books. I'm just saying, how do we make sure that the families are aware of what's in there?
So we talked about the next step, to your point, and again, this would be our first primary step, but that next step is to create that classroom inventory around what those are, and then have that accessible, almost like the library system's accessible. It's not there yet,
Little libraries, there's a lot of books.
Exactly, and the library's catalog, but we've talked with how do we deploy resources to accelerate having that inventory, because you're right, we did not want to put the burden on the teacher to all of a sudden, I need you to inventory every book you have and what's there. It just doesn't exist right now, but that is a project.
It's a good summer job.
That's what we said, so I had talked about when I was in a former district, we hired, you know, high school kid, like that was their thing, was to catalog and create that. So Tim Harder was there and we talked about that as a project and a timeline and a next step. But at least this gets us that intermediate step. And it also calls out to families that kids come into contact with books in multiple ways. And so bringing awareness to that for them, and then how to, you know, work with the school to make sure that we're helping. But yeah, that's a second step that we would need. And we can use the system that we have for that inventory, it just doesn't exist right now. We also wanted to call out that families, community members can also view the library online resource database without any login. So again, Tim's building that page that shows them how to access that regardless of having login credentials of a child. And we'll add in those instructional videos on how to do that, so it's easily accessible for that. So this was kind of what we wanted to see. Is there anything missing in this language around, kind of, again, we've got some work to do around really saying where that line is, but we know that, and we'll get that done. Any questions, anything we think that we're missing, or things that we need to really get at some more?
If you know, my opinion, I don't think this is complete. I think there's a lot left to interpretation, just like we are at now. Who says this is inappropriate? You know, who says this is excessive? You know, who's gonna make that determination? I think we definitely need, if we're gonna do that, we need to have guidelines, and it sounds like we're on the way, but
Yeah.
I wouldn't say this is a complete document.
Correct. So this was the starting point for the language, so further refining that, getting at some of the rating pieces, but, you know, quite a step forward for the team. And curriculum, we were putting together a timeline to provide assurance of that next leg of the work, that we're doing that in a manner that first set of books and things, that's happening before we open our doors.
Yeah, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that, because, John, I agree, not complete. However, like the frame, and more than we have today. So we have a couple of choices, really, and one is we'll give our feedback to the curriculum committee. They will continue their diligence on it, and we can all gaze into the crystal ball. But eventually, it'll be complete. That could be 3 months from now. I mean, I'm just hypothetically. Or
Sure, to come up with a devised rating system if
yeah,
we were doing all that
exactly,
work.
right. That is not at all a complaint, but clearly we don't want to rush it, but we want to proceed with due diligence, but this isn't going to be done next week. The flip would be if the curriculum committee thinks, look, this is not done, but we're advancing the ball down the field. And do we consider adopting kind of iteratively? I'm not saying we have to, but it's under the old adage, on the one hand, something is better than nothing. And John, on the other hand, I agree with you if it's still subject to interpretation, and so we don't think it's terribly useful. Well, we shouldn't adopt it, but, you know, I'm thinking of iterative kind of from a project management perspective, if you know what I'm saying.
I would agree with that. I would agree that, you know, something's better than nothing, and this is a step in the right direction, we can always amend.
Yeah, exactly. That's my thought, because I think this is a journey, because if we're gonna wait to get this perfect, I think 3 months in my personal opinion, is unrealistic, and I don't really wanna wait that long. But we shouldn't hasten, and, you know, we don't wanna have something that's half-baked either. But if there are packets of deliverables that are usable and advance the ball down the field,
That
I
would be
think we
great.
should consider that.
That would be great. And again, we identified the same areas that we are now, but it got at all those core ideas and concerns and pieces without, again, and really too, looking at from a resource perspective, this really met that. And then, again, that awareness piece and that information piece. So with that, I'll work with Melanie as the chair of the curriculum committee. We had that other work in play. I'll talk with her around those pieces. We wanted to see this incorporated right into the policy, so it was in that text, and that we'd incorporate those concepts to be in that.
So generally speaking, Policy 361.1, selection of resources. I'm not saying every single word is going to stay the same, but largely speaking, that content will also remain in there. We're not deleting the remainder of 361.1.
Correct, this was
is supplemental.
defining pieces that were not defined in that policy. Again, takes 2 steps forward for us, I think, in this piece. And, you know, our administration, the curriculum committee, you know, we get it, we know what work is ahead, but, you know, to your point, I'd rather keep us moving forward on that piece. And then, any other things that you think, again, this was kind of the meat of what we wanted to see and where we wanted to do that, we'll keep that work, but anything else, as always, if you're thinking about something kind of after, you know, policy, just connect with me. We'll continue to advance this. What I will do is bring that language forward then to the board around these pieces, and I'll just say, look, we know we don't have these things fully defined, but I'll at least advance that forward for the board, because we've talked about it at both curriculum committee as well as here, so I'll advance that.
No, I like that idea, and I think, you know, this is a large project, and if we are able to put it into nice bite-sized chunks, like I said, kind of move the ball down the field.
This was the biggest piece, but I'd like to, with the time, go through the rest of the policies associated and just talk about our discussion. I think this is the biggest piece, and this is getting at what we did, but there was some other work that we would be bringing forward for consideration. So I'm gonna give you that in packets, It's easier because so much of it is what we've got now. So we unpacked every policy associated. That was certainly the meaty one, right? Around,
He gets one more, okay.
I got you.
He felt like he was passed over for the birthday
I
treats.
did not. The only birthday this week is yours,
Well,
Mr.
that's
Schweigert,
true.
so.
That's true.
So I'll just go through these pieces. The very first clip packet you see is 330. So this was talking about standards aligned and goal-based curriculum development. In the buff color is what we currently, what we have, right? And it talks about, so what we talked about in that team was making that very clear to a reader. Right behind it are two pieces, 313 and 330. Standards is one thing. The board has to adopt standards and we need to communicate those to a family. So this policy that exists right now, 330, that talks about standards aligned, goal-based curriculum development, that is full of educational jargon just in the title alone, and it's not clear what that means. We as a team took the draft of 313. It says it's currently included in 330 with a little less detail. All this beginning piece here, it's right behind that.
Right.
Yep,
In the
in
same-
that
in the
first
same
paper
clip
clip, same
packet?
clip, stay in the same clip always.
Okay.
Okay, so we talked about using our current language about standards, which is really just the first couple paragraphs there, around our obligation as a board to review and formally adopt or take action on standards. And then we fleshed it out a little bit with more of the legal language around what standards are, how we're gonna communicate those, whose responsibility it is. There's laws around the adoption, the communication of those. So updating that so it was more clear, this is what academic standards are, here's the process, and these are authorized by a board. And they have to be communicated to a family. So cleaning up that language, right? So any question about kind of why we pulled that out? The other piece that the committee does is the curriculum development and improvement. That's a little bit more clear as a title instead of the goal-based curriculum development. So the policy is 330, and we used our current language, and we unpacked how we go around curriculum development and put that together and left that. And it's the board's responsibility around pieces, it's the administration's. You can see my notes, we talked about, well, it's the administration sometimes acts on the board's behalf on some things, so we were saying that needed to be clarified, but this is getting in curriculum development and improvement. The curriculum committee gets the plan annually around what is up for renewal, how are we gonna develop it, you know, what is that gonna look like? But it gives us the room, which we have existing, and we've all experienced this, especially with Tim's area in career and technical education. Sometimes we're having to rapidly switch those. So our most recent was the ProStart curriculum with the culinary piece.
The safety standards.
Yep, they updated those, so that wasn't on that curriculum plan necessarily. So it gives us room, but it's again, making sure that that's going to that authority around, this is our curriculum plan. Here's how we review it. Here's the pieces we're gonna take. We went in around engaging the community in the evaluation of that and just setting some expectations into language so that no matter who's where, these are the expectations and hear how that process will go. And again, the biggest thing around how we engage in that and how we go through and create that plan and that it comes before the board. So we unpacked those two pieces and gave a little bit more accountability in the language because that sets the kind of big umbrella with standards and curriculum development. Lost my pen somewhere. Any questions on
So there are two documents that are attached, the one with language for reconsideration and the other one which is current with less detail.
So in the buff color, you have current.
Current, right.
And what we did was we unpacked our current, we fleshed out a little bit more about standards, and made the curriculum really clear.
Got it.
And again, I think it's
Oh,
got,
I see.
Yep.
That second one would be 313.
correct, they're labeled
Got it.
then appropriately. 313 is really
Okay.
the label used for
two separate
academic
policies.
standards, yeah. And
That was
so-
caught under the fold.
Oh,
All I saw
sorry.
was, no, it's my
Sorry,
bad. It says
sorry.
currently included in 330. I'm like, oh, 330. Now I
Yeah.
get it. Thank you.
And it shouldn't, it's 313 deals with academic standards, so we were unpacking that, putting them where they are, and making this really kind of publicly accessible language around what that means and what you can expect us to follow as a district. And again, getting in those pieces of engagement we want to see, that there's a plan that's set forth, that's brought forward.
The academic standard wouldn't have the number of credits needed?
No, that's a different policy, great question. So this is just the overall umbrella of standards that they follow. We'll be bringing back the academic standard, the number of credits for graduation, that's its own standalone.
Yeah, I thought I saw it in a different one, I just didn't know if it got changed.
Nope, you're right, we've got that one on the docket to come back because we wanted to raise the bar there. Great, so that takes us through that 330 piece around standards. The next paper clipped piece, and you'll see that that was kind of that meaty document that I talked about, this 361.1. We want to see that language and we want to see the AR actually folded into policy. So to mock that up, make that a little bit more readable. An AR is a supplementary piece, so at curriculum committee, we would prefer to see those things stand together and incorporate all those topics that we talked about, that fleshes out, all those concepts and that expectation. So we would, we'd like to see all of those pieces brought together under the policy. Then the piece that would stay with it, it already exists, same content, but I would label the 361.1 exhibit and 361.2 an exhibit, and that's that form for reconsideration that we've been talking about, that we received a couple already. I would have it in two places as a standalone form. We thought that would be easily accessible for our public. Right now, it's in the policy piece around that, and I think it should be the policy, and then it should be, here's the form, and we'll convert it to a fillable link or a standalone printed link, and make that really easily accessible. And we decided it should be actually present in two spots as a form that's easily accessible, both in the piece around instructional resources as well as the other one around media in the libraries. So that's what we wanted to see happen with that. And then just looking at the format of that, it's a lot, so making sure that it was visibly pleasing, easy to follow along, kind of in some chunks, so that people could go to sections that they were most interested, kind of that reader-friendly piece. So again, incorporating everything we talked about with all those topics, getting it into policy, folding the AR in, and making that form really easily accessible.
It's not put together like that here.
It is not right now, that's what we're saying that's what we wanted, and that we wanted it in policy language. So if the team's okay with that, I don't see any reason to not. We were just gonna be in attention to kind of the readability and making sure we've got it chunked with some headings and real clear for the reader. But we'd like to see all those concepts in the policy itself.
I think that makes sense.
Will we keep all of this together in here?
Yes,
Because like Chris was saying, if we're gonna do it as an iterative, advance.
this
then it'd
will
be
all
easier to
stay
keep
together, correct. One package, so then we touch it the next time, it's all one. We don't have all these parts and pieces that go with it, because people may or may not know to go to the parts and pieces. That's why we, as a committee, curriculum committee, wanted it should be all just one thing and very easy. Great, we will advance that piece too and incorporate those topics that we talked about right into that language. Again, I think it's a great step forward. Not perfect, but let's get there.
Absolutely.
362, so that next packet, it leads with 362. It's not labeled correctly. We had these 6 pieces in this policy. So you see this is always my favorite date, you guys. I bring it up every time, May 8th, 1972. My
That's
birthday.
Magic Day, yeah.
It's my birthday. So follow me with the buff colored one, and it was 6 pieces. Right behind it, you see 361.2. This is new language. I grabbed they were labeled 1 through 6 in 362. We led with that, right? We still had those pieces, that responsibility. We took out the 21st century in bullet number 1, point number 1. It said 21st century. We're well into the 21st century. That's some antiquated language there. So we did that. But we held with the bullets, and then you can see my little note, because it was to assure comprehensive collection and appropriate for the users. We had just cut off accidentally that last bullet, and we were restating that. So it was grabbing this existing language, getting it, leading with it, and then just taking out that 21st century piece, and then giving a little bit more detail because it gets at the Library Media Center's material selection. We added reconsideration to that title as well. So this would be below it, new language, and again, gives that accountability. And this is where I'm saying that reconsideration form should also exist as a standalone form right behind this. So this gets at not just the instructional resources, but those pieces found in the library. It's a lot of, some of the WASB template language brings us up to date on that. So it marries kind of what we had in those beliefs, flushes that out a little bit more, makes it easy for general public reader around books exist in the instruction, in the classroom, as well as the Library Media Center. Any questions?
So just,
Go for it.
just quickly, so we have a policy or a series of policies on selection of resources. This is for,
This is the Library
This is
Media
library.
Center.
yeah, so why, just philosophically, why need 2? Because you think, well, selection of resources should include what's in the library, but there's a reason for this.
Yeah, there's a difference. This is covering, and then it's twofold. Right behind it, you also see, so your Library Media Centers are comprehensive collections, so you're getting at the philosophical piece around those collections. To our point, there may be some more things accessible, even when you get up at a high school. You know, you're getting that aren't used in instruction, but you have availability for students.
Well, that's what I thought you were going to say, that you've got selection of resources related to various classes. And then you have the library, which is a
A
broad
collection.
variety of, you know, a wide array of reference materials, for instance.
Correct.
Not necessarily tied to curriculum. Is that kind of the main
Correct.
difference?
Yep, a student
Okay.
may exist, you know, they're gonna have books in that collection that they never touch. You know, they're not required for instruction, they're not, you know, they're just there as part of a comprehensive collection. So these 2 policies, because again, we didn't have anything in existence, so we took what we had, kind of the foundational ideas, baked them into this with a little bit more detail, and then right behind it gets at what those services associated with the Library Media Center are. So we're doubling down on some of the language in those pieces and making sure that that's really clear for our public around where resources exist and how they exist. So again, kind of increasing the expectation. Any questions around that expansion?
Makes sense.
Great. And the last one, we did not touch, it's the controversial issues one, because again, we've had a lot of things being controversial. We talked about resetting where that boundary was in the earlier work, so we did not recommend any changes around the controversial issues. We did talk about just updating the AR in that piece, but it was nothing that we went through as a team.
So the thought is by increasing the standards or identifying
Correct.
definitions and such, that work in the other.
We were tightening that up and making that exposure mitigated. and then creating that awareness, and again, bringing that choice, if there were anything like that, right back to a family, that there had to be consent.
You're talking about appropriateness, that is contemplated within the earlier work that we just looked at.
Correct.
So that's why,
Correct, so that team did not have any recommendation for those pieces. We talked about our regular cycle, just looking at, the AR pieces, but we had no recommendations there. We felt that our work was really strong in the policies prior that helped us get at the resource selection and the expectation there.
so this essentially would be a leave as is.
Yep, no recommendation at this time. Again, we'd like to move forward, so kind of hearing that I can bring these forward then for readings with our full board. I'll make sure and connect with the curriculum committee around, our work to advance their work, if you will. And then bring that forward to our full board with that background. I'll clean up some of the language pieces we talked about. I'll highlight those discussion points for us that we should have with the full board, and then we'll bring that forward for conversation on those pieces. So again, I think really good forward movement, knowing that there's still work to be done. Any questions? Great. Looking at the time, our next piece are the 800 series. One of the pieces, instead of trying to unpack, we generally have an end time at 6 o'clock. What I'd like to do is bring a concept forward right away the next time we meet. In the 800 series, many of these, in the very end, 880, are all these relations with community governmental organizations. I have, what does that look like with the fire department, law enforcement, parent school, all of those, that should all be folded into one comprehensive policy around our relations with other entities. So if that's okay with this group, I'll bring that draft right back, so that we're looking at that language right away. There's no need for it to be all these separate standalones to guide that. We should have kind of some umbrella that guides our work.
Beyond that, at least in this first display of the 800s that we have in our packet,
Correct.
did you anticipate changes?
Yes, I do, but I at least would like to bring that right forward to you with that draft language, if you're okay, that just, it's a change in concept how we approach it, knowing we can't dig into those pieces today.
Sure.
We'll save that for next time. If that works for the team, then I'll do that, and then we could end relatively on time without digging in. I hate to open it up
Yeah, only put it
and
back.
only be able to carve out a bite of it when it's a big chunk of work, if that's okay with the committee.
Right, unless there are objections, that would conclude our review activity at this point?
Yes.
Okay. Any final questions or thoughts? Thought we covered a lot of ground. And please extend our thanks to the curriculum committee for obviously putting a lot of work on this.
Yeah.
More to come, and that's not a complaint, that's with our thanks.
I
You
will.
guys put a lot of thought
I'll
into
make
this.
sure to communicate that. I'm really proud of the work. I'm really proud of the discussions that we had. I think that we are kind of a front runner, and we'll continue to work collaboratively to meet that. So
Great.
thank you.
Well then, unless there are objections, we will consider ourselves adjourned. Any objections? All right, it is 5:50, we are adjourned.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Oh, John, are you shutting off my camera for Thank you.
Computer part.
I know, it's horrible.